Thank you so much for coming out today. It's a beautiful day. It's nice of you to make the sacrifice out here, yeah? Of course, I wanted to thank the festival for having me. I wanted to sort of, again, thank all the folks who made the event possible. You know the deal. Plenty of people work super hard to put these things together, and I really appreciate that work. Almost all of it invisible, yeah? Again, as always, it's always a great honor to be here to talk about art, and what art provokes. Now, I always feel like there is some sort of false advertisement, right? I saw the schedule and they said a keynote presentation, which is a very funny thing. I don't know what it is. I think that we have patterns and it doesn't matter what people tell us. Do you know those like evidence resistance belief loops? Yeah. It doesn't matter, like anyone who's ever asked me to go anywhere, the first words out of my mouth is that I do not do keynotes at all. I don't like prepared comments. I'm an artist, I'm terrible at it. I also think I kind of, I sort of got allergic to it also, as well as any of us who grow up in the sort of Latin American intellectual writer tradition. The appalling formality of that sort of vision of what an artist is always made me want to hang myself. Yeah, so in Santo Domingo and other folk places, writers would actually, the ones when I was coming up, they would write out a long 22-page paper and then present it. And again, I don't know what it is. I've never really liked it at all. Maybe also as well, I sometimes think that part of this is probably just so much of what, why I'm interested in being an artist. Is like, there's something about the nature of that interaction, and to sit still while someone delivers 20-something pages, which can be incredibly useful. But for some reason, for me, I just don't seem to have the ability for it. So this is a long way of telling you, you ain't getting no fucking keynote whatsoever. Even though I told them, I warned them, they still put it up. I wonder if they think people are more likely to come if there's some sort of formalistic, programmatic rubric to it. I don't know. I can't imagine why anyone would extra excitedly come for a keynote versus an artist talk, but such is the way to all different folks. I guess I always begin by asking just some simple questions, and then I'll explain to you how I'm thinking about doing this. I'm always curious, is there anyone from New Jersey here, my beloved home state?
Yeah.
Oh, where in New Jersey?
Scotch Plains.
Oh, I know Scotch Plains well.
Yeah.
Okay. Is this another Jersey person?
Exit 13.
Oh, wow. I know 13 extra well. Yeah. Yeah, no. Yeah, we used to call growing up East Brick City. Yeah. Oh, man. I was exit 11. Yeah, okay. Huh. It's always good to see some folks. I'm wondering if there's any other people from my other beloved, like, identity locations. Any immigrants here? What's up? Very silently. Where are y'all from?
I'm Mexican.
Okay, where?
From Sinaloa.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Cool. I spent a year in DF and never made it to Sinaloa. And DF is kind of like a labyrinth. I fell in love and didn't feel like leaving. Yeah, what about you?
Mexico, Chihuahua.
Oh, Chihuahua, okay. Again, all my friends are like from all these places and they're always like, come, and I just never left El DF. Every time I went to the periphery, it was like some strange vampire thing started happening. Like I couldn't move too far from my coffin, Yeah, okay, cool. How about any Latinos here? Still very silent. Fucking Denver does it to you, huh, you guys? For real, I asked that question in Jersey and people are like, no, it's okay. We all have different relationships to public space.
We're the OGs of Latinos.
The OGs?
OGs.
Is that what it is?
That's right. We've been here a long time.
Yeah, my God, you guys have been here a hell of a long time. Okay, and finally, is there any Dominicans whatsoever? Wait, we have one?
Well, kind of close. My grandpa's Dominican.
Shit, I'll take it. Come on, man. One must be generous with our visions of each other, you know? The nation is profoundly predicated on hybridity, not purity, so nice to hear it. Well, thank you guys all for being here. So look, here's what I'm thinking. We have an hour, yeah? And my nature is always to try to bring it in on time. And so I thought we would have a little talk, yeah? About what y'all want to talk about. I feel like that might be the best approach to these sort of things. I could give you some sort of prefatory comments, of course, which would be utterly useless, but you know, sometimes people require that. But I figured we could just talk. I mean, the thing is you must understand that I'm someone, like many of you, from what would be called a non-traditional artist background. Yeah, I did not come up either in a community or in a family or in a social milieu where pursuing the arts was even a remote possibility. And on top of that, I came up in a period in time when there were still a number of, you know, sort of intriguing youth movements that were still kind of pushing up against the world, yeah? The strange thing about growing up in the 80s, for those of us who came of age there, is that young people in the 80s really thought that the 90s was going to be a return to the 60s. Yeah. When you look at all the different movements and sort of all the kind of weird political organizations that were in circulation at the time, the imaginary was one that was actually supremely radicalized. And I kind of came up thinking that we were going to turn the corner and that all of these sort of utopian dreams of a lot of the folks that were ahead of me in college, that were ahead of me in organizations, that they were kind of bringing down into the neighborhoods, we really thought this was going to happen. And I think it's, I always say it's sort of nothing more emblematic about growing up in my generation than when you think about the two large musical streams that were most current in the geography that I grew up in. I always think like, listen, I grew up with like super crazy hip hop on one side and punk on the other, like literally parallel to each other. And that both of those spoke to a very different generational youth moment than I think we ended up sort of living in later. And as an artist, I also kind of was in this strange situation where I came up wanting to be an artist. When I thought of it, when I narrativized it, it had a lot to do with growing up in a space both inside of my family and inside of the larger culture in which I was embedded, that we, folks like me, my family and my community, were almost entirely disavowed. Way of saying we were entirely erased. Inside my family, of course, the trauma of immigration. Immigration for many people is profoundly traumatic. You know, there's that great line about immigration. You know, all immigrants are broken, some beautifully. You know, but it's the nature of immigration for most of us to be deeply traumatic, and usually what ends up accumulating when families have to bear enormous costs to immigration is silence. You know, there's a tremendous amount of silence. Of course, also, for our particular case, we were a post-dictatorship society. We were coming out of the Dominican Republic after a 31-year dictatorship, which had savaged the country. Basically, most people, when they think of dictatorships, they tend to think of a dictatorship along the lines of a more kind of a Western model, where already modernity is just in place. And so the dictatorship seems to be this kind of anomalous sort of, you know, repressive force. Well, in Santo Domingo, the Trujillo dictatorship basically seizes the Dominican Republic before anything that we could call modernity becomes operational at the level of a nation state. And so Santo Domingo suffered inordinately from this all-controlling, nearly totalitarian regime. And part of what comes out of that, of course, is when you have a ton of death squads, a ton of torture, when it's a sort of completely carceral, repressive regime, when the whole half of the island which you belong to is sealed off from the larger world, where, you know, you can read these great journals by Puerto Rican sailors. Yeah, Puerto Rican sailors would come to the Dominican Republic, and all of their journals would say the same things. They would be like, the sooner I can get out of here, the better, because this place seems like a haunted house, because this place seems like everybody is a zombie, because the amount of fear in the population. And, you know, we can think of those things in context, of course, thinking of North Korea and East Berlin, but in a nation like, you know, the Dominican Republic, in a hemispheric space like the Caribbean, that wasn't normal. And so there was this enormous amount of silence which has been sedimented not only in the kind of diasporic concept of Dominicanness, but also in my own family. And immigration on top of that, yeah. And then, of course, the larger culture, which I've sort of kind of gesturing towards, where being a Dominican immigrant of readily unidentifiable African descent meant that the multiple levels of erasure in the larger cultures. First, immigrant. Guys, look, we're in 2013 and we still work overtime to negate the presence and contributions and the utter necessity of our immigrant communities. We still can't even deal with it at our national moment right now. You could imagine what it was like in the 70s and 80s, and perhaps even earlier, you know? And then, of course, there was all the other issues. A country that had sort of created this weird consensus that had no connection to reality in the Northeast around how whites, black, and Latinos and Asians took up certain categories, yeah? That these groups were these certain neat, tidy things, and they each sort of did these and represented these spaces, and that's the way it was going to be. Now, of course, this is all a lie. None of this is truth. Nobody can divide any group that neatly. Well, I came from a community that profoundly disrupted all of what we would call the ethno-racial commonplaces of the Northeast. So that you had Dominicans who were coming in who, for all intents and purposes, looked completely African-American and were Latino. And so this kind of uneasy thing that had been created in New York City, in the New York City area, of Latinos being this weird middle category between whites and blacks, yeah, completely gets thrown out the window when Dominicans come in. And when I think of myself as an artist, I think of all of these multiple areas where I found myself as a young Dominican immigrant growing up having absolutely no frameworks, no languages, no continuities, and no communities that could kind of indicate how I could describe or explain or contest some of these sort of received frameworks that kept me erased and kept what we would call our particularity sort of off the table. And as an artist, I think that if anything what drove me to be an artist was probably the fact that both inside my family and outside my family, I was somehow embodied an impossibility. Just an impossibility. And I think many people are like that. Most of us are far too complex to fit any of the formulas that our families and our neighborhoods and our societies want to inflict on us. I don't think there's absolutely anything atypical about my experience. My experience might seem a little bit more explicit because of the certain historical tendencies and how it kind of works across certain community lines. But in general, what I experienced as a young person growing up, I think in many ways is something familiar for most of us. Is that we live in a society of simplistic formulas that don't permit real people to present themselves fully. And most of us spend a lot of energy, or we're taught to spend a lot of energy, deforming ourselves so that we can conform to other people's simplistic ideas of what the hell we are. And what the costs of that is, because as a young person, I found myself cutting so many pieces off of myself to fit in. You know, I grew up in a predominantly black community in Central Jersey. And they were like, we're okay with you, just don't fucking speak Spanish. No, straight up. They're like, don't ever fucking talk Spanish. You know what I mean? And then I grew up again in a predominantly Puerto Rican, Latino context before we began Dominicans coming in waves. And they were like, okay, we're cool with you, just we're not immigrants, so we don't fucking care. Like, we don't suffer the same shit y'all do. We got passports. And I often think that for me as an artist, and I'll leave it here, for me as an artist, the amount of sort of self-mutilation that one does as we grow up to fit in. I think often what drives my work is literally remembering myself, to put the pieces back, yeah? To think about the costs that this inflicts on communities and young people. And I often find that for me, the image that sticks with me most, I think, plangently as an artist is the sense that I felt like most of my childhood was me being sort of pulled apart in so many different directions. And the only way that I've been able to reassemble myself is through my art. And I think most of us are like this. Most of us are in pieces held together by a very weak field, yeah? And we're trying to figure out what the hell that means and how the hell that can happen and what is it? And so that's me in a very kind of a nutshell. And I thought I would leave it there and perhaps we can have a conversation about anything you wish. In fact, you don't even need to refer to any of my comments. But I figured a little context wouldn't hurt. And also it's good to know that, like, you know, it's good to know that your interlocutor at least has some content and didn't come just merely to chat. Okay? So why don't we begin, yeah?
Does anyone have questions for Mr. Diaz? Back here?
You know, I'm looking at you young people, right? I'm waiting to find out what your questions are, you know? Are you guys from, like, I'm sorry, but you look really young to me. Are you guys from a high school?
Yes.
So where's your teacher? You guys are so nice, yo. Your teacher brought you out here? Why? What did they tell you?
Because we volunteered.
Yeah.
That's so nice. You guys just wanted to hang out with an artist, or?
Yeah. I like your shirt, by the way.
Oh, thank you. My friend made these shirts. I'll be right there. I'll be right there. You see, I'm from a big family. I'm used to dealing with this stuff. Huh. Okay. Did they make you read anything?
No.
So they were just like, this dude is kind of like got a Z in his name. Let's go look at him. Okay. I'll be wanting some questions from you soon. And you guys are lucky. My teachers never brought me anywhere. So thank you. Yeah, and what grade again?
We're sophomores.
Even though you're probably taller than me, to me, because I'm 45, you guys look. Yeah. Madame, what's your question?
Hi, and thanks so much for coming out here. I enjoy your work, and I was just wondering if you feel that the bookends that you talked about between punk and hip-hop infuse your work.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't disagree. I mean, but I think that that's always too... For me, I always just look, you gotta understand, I'm really uncomfortable with sort of the way that we can use kind of what I would call consumer labels to get a shorthand for explaining who we are. Like, I've always felt like my writing was always like, it couldn't exist without hip hop, but I never walked around saying I was a hip hop writer, because it always seemed like such a cheap shortcut label and a way to kind of claim a cooler space that one is, you know? So, I mean, I would assume that the answer would be yes to that. But I think what's had a greater impact is the universe that made both forms possible, yeah? The way that the disinvestment in young people, the sort of kind of savage criminal economies that we unleashed on urban communities, the way these things came about around the same time and therefore produced in totally what would seem disparate communities, a kind of a similar insurgent creativity for me, I think I heal more from that than I would argue the specific moment. Because my creativity was being formed at the same time as these creativities were being put into circulation. And so sure, but it's probably a little more complicated than that, you know?
Your thoughts and feelings about Calle 13's multiviral?
What specifically? I'm interested. What do you, because that's like a big,
Just thoughts and feelings.
but I guess, listen, I'm not trying to be like kind of dense. Like what about it are you interested in? And then maybe I can vibe off that.
Something.
What interests you about it, I guess is what I should ask.
It's international character of language, English, Spanish, Arabic, and some French of the performers, Palestinian, Puerto Rican, British, or Julian Assange, and the Rage Against the Machine kid.
Zach or the other one? Yeah. Tom, is it? Yeah. Well, look, no, but I mean, I've always think that, of course, I always think that there's nothing that intrigues and nothing that carries greater promise than these kind of like what we would call cross-fertilizations. You know, these sort of like weird collectives. Yeah, and I'm all about it. I'm a big fan. I think that the crazy stuff is that despite what we think, we're more isolated and atomized and divided than we ever are. And so not only are those projects, I think, absolutely essential for maps, they also remind us that despite this kind of proliferation of these technologies that allow us to connect to people and halfway across the world and cheap air travel, the fact is most poor people are more segregated and isolated than they've ever been. And that what passes for diversity in our communities, so we'll walk downtown and we'll see a bunch of diverse people. People go to New York and they're like, New York is so diverse. But last time I checked, New York City's poor communities have never been more isolated. They have never lived in more, you know, sort of restricted spaces. And so I think that for me, I think it's very important because it helps to imagine what would be a kind of a radical possibility, but also because there's something really bewildering about the fact that we feel so rhizomatically interconnected to people, but we've never been more isolated. Classes no longer come into contact with each other in any way that's meaningful. I look at my mom and people are like, oh, she's that old generation. My mom had more interclass contact than the average person has today. Because these great barriers, what we would call the sort of network society in which we live, hadn't been put into place yet. And so think about how much public space my mother inhabited, where she was going to encounter people from different cultures and different classes on an everyday. There's almost no public space left at all. And any public space that we have is so, you know, patrolled and under so much surveillance and has been schematized and culturalized in certain ways that we're not really coming into contact with anyone that isn't pretty much like us. And you know, the great critic, Samuel Delaney, describes two basic interactions that cities facilitate. And he describes, first, there's contact. And contact is people of different classes, races, groups, geographies, coming into absolutely unmediated random contact. Where like you will sit down next to somebody and you're a millionaire and there's a motherfucker who's homeless. And it doesn't have to be that diametrical. Contact is what cities used to always provide. Because whether you were on 42nd Street or you were in all of these public spaces, all of these groups would descend and they would rub shoulders. Yeah? What's occurred now is that that has been demolished, and now there's only network. And network means that you basically encounter people in your network. So that if you're of a certain class, that's who you're encountering in the village. If you come from a certain educational background and a certain privilege, that's who you're encountering in Williamsburg, these quote-unquote diverse spaces. Yeah? And people's networks are overriding and overwhelming, and that there's so little contact anymore. And that what people call contact wouldn't pass muster from what used to be contact in the 1950s. Yeah? And so I'm interested in how this stuff reminds us that just because technology has altered social relationships, it seems to have kind of brought us together. In fact, there's other forces that have pulled us apart and have denied us the ability to form coalitions across robust sort of lines. Yeah, and I think that for me, that's what's essential. Part of the reason that, we keep getting gouged by our political elites is because it's almost impossible for people to organize organically across these barriers. And almost always these people who are organizing across these barriers, it's so narrow and it's not coming from the communities because communities are so cut off. So that's what I think about when I think of that, Madame, and then we'll slide back there.
So, well, wow,
Go ahead.
thank you. In terms of talking about space, I think it's really interesting that we're here in this public space, given that just a couple of years ago, this is just like right over there, was the space of Occupy. And I think that for me in my political coming up, was the first space where, maybe not the first space, maybe the immigrant rights marches back in '06, which also happened just right here, took place. But Occupy was the first time that I saw class being talked about openly in society as disruption of, over the overarching political conversations. Can you talk a little bit about, have you seen other interesting sorts of Occupy or what are your hopes around Occupy? Just because I think that this space here was so policed immediately following, the city of Denver passed a camping ban to criminalize homelessness. And they'll say oh, we weren't criminalizing homelessness and blah, blah, blah. But they totally did. And I think since that moment, I haven't seen good, smart political protests be able to break through in the same way that Occupy did.
Well, I don't know if I feel like you said most of what needs to be said. I don't know how much I can add to that. I just know for a fact, look, Mitt Romney lost the presidency because of Occupy. That's that. And what's interesting is how little they want to remind people that before Occupy brought to a public attention inequality and plutocratic economic violence, you could run as a billionaire as president and never have to explain yourself.
Yeah.
And that altered the debate entirely. There is a guy running for president that a week before the Occupy movement started off felt he had needed to explain his zillions, not whatsoever. And so I'm always cautious because I always think of it, again, I'm sort of by nature trained as a historian, and I just always think that the point of the human is that we don't seem to function along what would be called, what would be the description? We don't seem to function along Newtonian lines. So in Newtonian physics, Newton physics, where things are kind of very direct and very linear and they're very predictable, the idea of the Newtonian physical universe versus, say, more of a sort of the Einsteinian, the great revolution in relativity, the general model, where we're more quantum, we're more unpredictable. Things don't build up the way that we would like them. We would prefer a quantum universe. We would prefer that activism, youth activism, would build as like a wave and would add up and add up. But that's not the way it happens. Usually in the most conservative moment of any culture, there is the most powerful eruption. Usually at the places where you would think that people should be most bugging, they don't. And for me, the long-term ideas about this is that, look, you gotta remember, and I'm sure you do, the forces that are arrayed against anyone trying to alter this sort of hammerlock on the human imagination. There are trillions of dollars out there demotivating people from imagining that a better tomorrow is possible. Utopian impulses and utopian horizons have been completely disfigured, and everybody now is fluent in dystopia. My young people's vocabulary, their fluency is in dystopic futures. When young people think about the future, they don't think about a better tomorrow. They think about horrors and end of the worlds and things are worse. Well, do you really think the lack of utopic imagination doesn't play into demotivating people from imagining a transformation in the society? I mean, Frederick Jameson was talking about this shit like 30 years ago when Jameson said, and to paraphrase, he said it's easier for people to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I mean, it's insane. And so as someone who's an activist from a long time, but also as someone who's an artist, you can't look back at the pageantry that is the human and not have great faith that one day this malign condition, which immiserates so many people and dehumanizes so many people and is basically on the point of just devouring the planet, that we can't overturn it. It seems that we're human, so we like to do shit the hard way. No, for real. Like, we're not Vulcans. If we were Vulcans, this shit would be set. I would be like, capitalism is a toxic ideology. We must stop this. But we're not. We're not. We're all like, climate change? What climate change? Race? Race doesn't exist. We're post-racial. Like, we're all just whatever, blank deniers. When I was a historian, when I was learning to be a historian, they first taught us about Holocaust deniers. And I used to think, wow, that's so crazy. And then I inherited a society where everyone is a Holocaust denier. Where the same muscles that propel a Holocaust denier are the muscles that we're all trained in. But just pick what you're denying. And everybody's like, I deny race, I deny class, I deny that this is like a malign system, even though the planet is literally 1 week from going kaput. And I guess we're just gonna do this the hard way. We're gonna do it the hard way. It just seems like we can't learn unless we kill half the planet off. I hope that doesn't happen, but in the end, my faith is total. How can you be an artist without having faith? I have to imagine in a culture that doesn't give a damn about the arts, that there's somebody out there that might be transformed by something I write. Shit, if you could imagine that your little art can transform an individual, then you certainly can imagine that a group of people one day could transform a society. Sir, you had a question.
You mentioned the sometimes fricative relationship between newcomers and older generations of immigrants, and also the decrease in multi-class accessibility in our country and elsewhere. But I wondered, in spite of all that, if you have a sense of Pan-Americanism from attending events like this, and what the possibility for environmental issues serving as a web issue for these very disparate groups.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's a great question, because I don't think that this generalization, because remember guys, look, we're in a short space, we have an hour, we're trying to talk. There's no way you can have a conversation without shorthand. It's the nature of conversation, that it's shorthand, and you just muster shorthands against each other and hope that that generates some sort of intellectual heat that will lead to much more nuance, And so certainly I'm like a huge believer that despite that kind of rubric of the repressive elements in our society, there's a whole wide range of shit where people are trying to do other things. There's a whole wide range of institutions and movements and communities where people are up to everything that makes us possible. I'm emblematic of it, you guys are, all of us who do these sort of things are. My sense with your question is that the forces of nationalism seem to increase with every year. And nationalism is a natural antagonist to the idea of a pan-American concept of like environmentalism. Because man, I don't feel that people are all that sensitive to the fact that most folks who are immigrating, whether they're Haitians immigrating to the Dominican Republic or whether they're folks immigrating across the border, are both climatic and economic refugees. What they're trying to tell us is ignore the fact that half the world's on fire. The people who are showing up to our doorsteps covered in soot are criminals. And there's many of us who refuse this. But I do think that we're seeing, before the snap, we're going to see this massive increase in trying to convince people that the national project, the nationalist project, is really important. And I actually think that this increase in this nationalistic fervor is indicative of how well people are doing to raise these issues. Because would you need such a hotly kindled, malign nationalism if stuff wasn't happening below? Do you remember Alice in Wonderland Through the Looking Glass? Do you remember the Red King? Do you remember the Red King? Remember the Red King's asleep. And they all worry. Is it the Queen?
Isn't it the queen?
I think it's the Queen.
Okay, somebody look it up. I don't mind being wrong, just so that I'm not wrong 3 times. I spend my life being wrong. It's book 2 of Alan Moore's Miracle Man. Is it the Red Queen syndrome or the Red King syndrome? One of them is asleep. And they tell Alice, they're like, don't wake them, because if you wake the Red Queen, we may all be their dream. And if you wake them, we'll disappear. And I think that the reason these dream-like ideologies are being cooked up with greater intensity is because the Red Queen or the Red King is beginning to awaken. We're beginning to awaken, and so they're having to hit us with higher doses of crack. And I really believe it. Because if we were an awakening, you wouldn't even need nationalism to deal with us. So that's what I'm thinking.
To move it away from the philosophical and the esoteric and move it to the personal, because of your success as an artist, do you ever worry about complacency? And also, how do you make sure that you live up to the expectations that you set for yourself?
But I mean, I guess my thing is that we're just human. Do you know, it all depends what's your regime. Like my personal regime doesn't respond well to that. Because I know how imperfect and flawed I am. Whatever standard I set for myself, I will fail. I mean, I've never lived in that. I felt like my dad was a military man, and he just had this idea that we can live up to things. Well, what happens if I get cancer tomorrow? Can I live up to it anymore? And I often think a lot of the schemata that we create for our own personal development and our own ideas about what we want for ourselves as artists, as thinkers, as activism, there are a lot of wishful thinking. Because chances are the world doesn't give a fuck about your plan. And chances are the world's going to serve you up lovely, irregardless of your plan. And my sense of it is I'm worked more in the other direction, which I'm trying to figure out how can I get enough compassion to forgive myself for all the anger I have at failing, forgive myself for the times that I didn't have the courage to do whatever I felt my standards were. You know, because we're all human, we're not perfect. We are going to disappoint. And the idea is that, well, you could deal with disappointment in certain ways. And for me, it's been easier to try to figure out how to be compassionate to myself. You know, because most of us grow up with disciplinary regimes that we think the only way that we can motivate ourselves to excellence is by laying on the whip. We have been taught that by being intolerant of yourself, simply saying, "Man, I'll make no excuses for myself," that this is somehow going to get more work out of you. Now, I have to tell you something. I'm like many of you. I grew up with the whip. You don't get through college working full-time because you're nice to yourself. You get through college with a full-time job delivering pool tables. Anybody ever try to lift up a Brunswick pool table? Because you're rough to yourself. Because you say no sleep. Because you say no play. Because you say no pain. Because you say no excuses. Because you say one mistake and I'm done. I've lived in that regime, you know. What I've discovered is that it's a short-term solution to a larger human problem. And the whip only works for so long. There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching someone still try to lay the whip on themselves when there's no bare piece of flesh that isn't scarred. And you can only use it for so long. And so for me, what I've discovered is now that my back looks like, you know, the Passion of the Christ, is that like, I've discovered that for me, my thing is just forgiving myself. Because I'm not going to live up to whatever it is. I will falter and I will die like all of us. And the courage that is required is not to be awesome. The courage that is required is how to be human. And I didn't know that when I was 20. I thought like, this shit never stopped going up. You know? So that's lately what I've been working on, you know? And it, you know, it's okay. It's totally okay for you to write one book and every one of your other books suck. It's okay for you to be awesome at this one moment in your life and things to go down. It's the way of life, man. You know? And we expect things out of ourselves that we wouldn't expect out of superhumans. Where else? Young person right here.
I'm Sarah. A lot of the people in this row are organizers, and I used to be an
Oh, what's up, guys?
Yeah. And I kind of wanted to go back to something you were talking about before, about sort of how we cut off pieces of our identity, because I feel like in the movement that can happen sometimes. Like, I know as a white organizer in a primarily an organization of primarily people of color, I felt like my main identity was being white. And I feel like for people of color, it's often that they're people of color and they're oppressed and they're angry. And I know like that's not always the case, but I feel like sometimes we, in the movement, like just allow ourselves to connect with each other based on privilege and oppression and not humanness. And I'm wondering kind of your thoughts about how we can fix that and how we can have a deeper conversation, deeper relationships with each other. And then also, a couple of us are now educators, and and we're educating primarily youth of color and immigrant youth, and we're having trouble being organizers, working in a system that is basically shaving off pieces of these children's identities and making them silent and laying on the whip, all the things you've been talking about. So how can we be better anti-racist educators as well?
Well, I mean, look, I think the first question is, look, we understand some things, is that I'm not sure, I hear you, you were asking a question, you were trying to kind of boil it down, and so I'm not sort of implying that this was what you were getting at, but I want to kind of broaden the question a little bit so that we can sort of, in my mind, what I've seen and what I think about, and I'm not fucking authoritative. This is just an artist who came up as an activist thinking about this stuff, you know? Take it for what it is, which is basically 0.1 of a 4 billion point conversation, yeah? But like, look, my thing is that especially in the movements, what we would call the kind of progressive movements, the folks that are doing stuff, look, all the positions of authority are white. When you go to the movements and you see who's in control of the funds, who's sort of doing this, they're like white and they're dudes. And I'm not sure we've had the conversation that needs to be had for us to start dealing with each other at a human level. I think that 99.99%, even in the most radical progressive groups, in other words, look, guys, I will introduce you to investment bankers because I teach at MIT. Do you guys know what my super smart students are doing instead of like working on physics problems? They're going to work for investment banking because we have monetized young people's ideas of the future. Young people don't think of the future as a great adventure or as a way to help the universe. For the most part, they're like, how can I make the most fucking money? And so my young people at MIT, they're sitting around and they're doing investment banking. I know a lot of investment bankers. And I can go to any investment banking company and they are more open to talk about race than progressive organizational leaders. It's crazy. You will get a bunch of investment bankers who are getting $1 million bonuses. And they're like, we got way too many white people on this team. They're like, change it the fuck out. From white people, oh yeah, they do. Oh yeah, see, what you guys forget is that capitalism works best when you've got folks. In other words, if I need to sell to people in Kerala, if I can get someone from Kerala or who's from that area, who's on the team, that works better than I can get Sandy fucking blonde haired. And they're discovering this now. And I'm not saying that these groups are not malign and that there's some sort of utopian alternative. What I'm saying is that I have been in these meetings and I've heard them be way more open to saying, how do we change this shit up? Now, do the main bosses want to change shit up? Hell no. Nobody who runs the banks is saying like, oh, let's get some brothers in here. They're like, fuck that. In other words, the plantation, they don't mind that shit being diverse, right? I don't want to get us twisted away from what the analogy was supposed to be. And the analogy is supposed to be that I'm not sure progressive movements are even caught up. In other words, I can go to a bank and say, you guys need diversity training. They're like, yep. I will go to a movement, a progressive group with these 3 white dudes who are running like, you know, women of color lesbian organization and be like, yo, you might need some training. Like, no way. No way, yo. And I think that what's going on in the progressive movements is what we see generally, which is that, guys, we reproduce the racial, cultural, class, power structures again and again and again unless we create counter patterns to prevent it. Let's just take this another way. Guys, do you want an alternative for anything? Why are dudes in charge of anything? No, I mean it. Like, why can't, I'm not just saying that for a sensational clap. Like, if you want a progressive movement, every organization has to sign up for a 10-year moratorium, no men in leadership roles. Like, start there. I mean, think about just how simple that is. But why not? Well, why not is because people who want their privilege maintained are not going to go for it. And so I guess I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I'm agreeing with that we're there. I think that we have to deal with how much white privilege is present in the most progressive movements. And when push comes to shove, it looks like an investment bank. A bunch of people of color from all over the world hustling accounts with 3 or 4 white dudes being like fist bumping over billions. They're like, word. You know? And look, listen, guys, chill. I mean, I always tell people to chill. Look, the thing is that we all got to have these conversations in reasonable ways because the world will have them for us. I mean, people seem to think that if we can pretend that shit isn't happening, that it goes away. The world is going to have these chats with us whether we want to or not. You know? And I guess the other question about education is, look, the problem is, as you know, as you guys are in the front row of it, the front line of it, is that we have a culture that has said that we no longer have any civic society. That everything must bend to the rationale of the market. Market logic in everything. Education is a civic function, but we no longer have civic functions. We only now have economic functions. So how in the world are you supposed to get around to educating young people when schools are now income and profit extraction sites? How in the world are we supposed to get to young people when, because they're income and profit extraction sites, we completely underfund young people's education?
Especially in Colorado.
You could pick them anywhere. But sure, Colorado. And I think that what's facing young teachers today is that we are really bugging. We are bugging, man. We have like gone way overboard. Just the economic logic that has fucking saturated everything. There's no way to learn when kids are not in an altruistic civic model. And kids are not stupid. If you think kids, even if they have no kind of radical education, aren't aware of the ethos of their educational moment, you're insane. Kids know the political unconsciousness of their families and of their institutions. Kids know. They know deep down that this shit is just a money-making scheme. And that all our claims that this is a civic function are being countered by the fact that they're being treated like cattle. And so, you know, the thing is that while we wait for shit to change, young people, super idealistic young people, are the ones who are holding this shit together. I mean, that's what's crazy, is that we're pushing it as far as we can to try to dehumanize and disrupt the system. And the only thing that's making it possible for anyone to receive any kind of education in most public schools are young folks and hardcore educators who are like, I'm going to be in the trench and I'm going to fight to the end. And we see how many people this system burns out. I have a friend, one of my best friends, yo. He worked in a Harlem middle school, public school. Think about this. Harlem middle school, 7th grade Harlem teacher. This kid was Korean American. He was the only Asian face, and this dude was in his school for 11 years till he burnt out. And guess what his next job was? So he could recuperate his humanity. He became a New York City police officer because that was an easier way for him to help people. And he's like 6 years on the force, and he's like, whew, this is a lot easier. He's like, I helped so many people, man. And I think that that's sort of indicative of how crazy things have gotten. And here's the deal. The truth is, how do you become better educators, anti-racist, et cetera, is you guys are doing it, but everything in this society is trying to thwart you. And the only thing that we can do is keep you guys in the game long enough. And I don't expect people to survive a regime like that long term. And the only way to survive is you guys have to figure out how to gather resources that make your longevity in these systems possible. And again, most of you guys drive yourself beyond the limits. You're not keeping shit in the tank. You're not thinking that this is a marathon. You guys are like thinking this shit is a sprint. And so most of you guys are burning yourself out early. You're not treating yourselves well. You don't eat right. Most people don't have a therapist. No, I'm not joking. Like, I believe this profoundly. If you're a teacher in a public school system and you don't have a therapist, there's a serious problem. Y'all laughing, but if we were athletes, we have no problems believing that athletes, because we think of athletes as high earners, and so we want athletes to be on point in every way. An athlete gets a physical trainer, they get a massage therapist, they get a couple of therapists, but teachers have to be treated the same way. You can't be a person of color in the society and not have a therapist. You can't be a woman in this society and not have a therapist. You can't be a dude who's gone through masculinity and not have a therapist. Masculinity will undo most men. Those of us who date, like, marry, or have family members with men, being a male in this society is like wearing a poison shirt all day. And so I think the larger question is we need to increase your survival, but you all have to start encouraging yourself to take care of each other. Because there's not going to be a solution. You guys know all you need to know. But are you nice to yourself? Are you compassionate? Do you have your therapist? Are you seeing a massage therapist every week? Are you taking care of your body? Because your body is where you're somatizing all your pain.
I hope you're not insulted by this question. If I were watching this video, I would really want to hear this question. And do you have a dog? I'm asking this because I read about you on Flavor Wire, and I read your article on Haiti, and that Haiti, the hurricane was not a man-made disaster. The infrastructure was so bad there that it was a disaster that was inevitable, and there's climate change that affects other countries, and it's happening all over the world. We're all in this together. And I went to a book discussion in Denver about the One Book on Denver, and it was a book that wasn't very light, and I loved it. It was about a dog, and it was called The Art of Racing in the Rain, and it was about a dog that had a sense of somebody having cancer and couldn't communicate at all. And
Boy, you are really, this issue's bothering you, huh? It's okay, it can.
The hopefulness that I get is that in the city there's squirrels, there's pigeons, there's funky moths that fly into the streetlights, and that they cut through class, and that they also want to encourage and nourish us beyond language.
I hear you. I don't have a dog. I got raised in a farm in Dominican Republic, and I have like it's messed up. I have a real mercenary attitude towards animals. I'm always like, what does this animal do? You know? No, for real. I'm like, it's messed up. And my girl like loves dogs. She is like, will murder me, because I'm like, this shit don't work. You know? Yeah. So look, guys, we have time for like 2 or 3 questions if they're short, and we're done.
It seems like the percentage of minorities in educational environments, especially the elite, has really not changed substantially over the last 20, 25 years. What I perceive the difference is before, where they were taking anybody, including kids from high school who couldn't write a complete sentence, got to go to college because that was equal opportunity. Now they're taking qualified candidates.
Yeah.
But the percentage doesn't change.
It's weird because I'm an educator, I work at a university, I'm in admissions, yeah, and I'm sort of interested in, what I mean by I'm in admissions, like we all have to do our service, so they always put me in admissions, I don't know why, you know, but the thing is that, look, and I think this is not a minor thing, is that, look, I think that what we should be very cautious about is that it doesn't take much to be a successful college student at most universities. I could take the average kid and they could sleepwalk through Harvard and graduate. If you're not going to be an engineer or a physicist, I'm sorry. You got to eat somebody to fail out of Harvard. You know? Well, it's true. It's true. I was over at Harvard for a year. Believe me, it's true. Unlike MIT, where MIT is like the Hunger Games. They're like, nobody wants to go to MIT unless you're ready to roll, because they're like, first semester, they're thinking, how can I get rid of you? Second semester, I need you gone. Where at Harvard, it's like, you've got to go through 9 steps to get rid of a student. Like there's dozens of safety nets. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, for me, the real issue is how our universities used to be space where we had contact. It used to be that you actually had more poor kids going to elite schools than you have now. In general, schools have also began to sort of, it's like a weird centrifuge, yeah? Besides a few elite schools who can afford to pay for whoever they want, on average, elite schools are attracting kids with money, and the state schools are doing all the heavy work of educating everyone else. I mean, I so remember being at Rutgers in 1990. I was at Rutgers, and Rutgers was a total cross, that was the State University of New Jersey, was a complete cross-section of New Jersey. Literally, the amount of working class kids who were in school with us. I went to Rutgers recently, and the average SAT score on the 1600 basis of Rutgers is now 1400. There are almost no working class kids at all. The school is absolutely prohibitive. I worked my way through Rutgers. No human being could work their way through Rutgers. And so for me, the problem tends to be more that what we're doing is that we're creating these weird, fucked up situations where we're not getting people together the way they need to be together. And look, the average kid, say what you want, the average kid with half a brain can get through our elite school systems. They just can, but we just don't want them to. They might not know the bells and whistles of our culture, but our kind of aggression, our fear of outsiders, there's a whole bunch of shit that the Neolithic has gifted us that people tend to not been able to get away from. Now, my thing is that I do believe that it is possible, I really believe that it is possible in the future to create a different civilizational imaginary. That the Neolithic, this imaginary where we count, where we believe in calendars, where we don't believe that the earth is anything more than like something, a bunch of beans that we can part or we can own, then I just think that this logic of like status and of sort of hierarchies and this logic of nature being a resource, that this actually is something that we can create a different story that alters social relationships. It's completely idealistic and it's completely utopian, but it happened once. I mean, this civilizational moment we have right now is a story that got told and it spread across the world. A story called the Neolithic. And before the Neolithic, people didn't think this way. And so I believe that, listen, we did it once. It is possible to dream up a story that can allow us to be more human. Is it going to happen tomorrow? No. But shit, we might as well keep the possibility open, because if we keep the possibility open, somebody might come up with it. Right now, they're trying to tell us that the Neolithic and all of these social relationships is an utter absolute. That's not historically true. That is not true. Our civilization is an artifact. And like all artifacts, they can break and they can change and they can be replaced. Just hope to God that the next civilization or the next imaginary that we collectively adopt will be more human and not less human. Yeah? Because I do think, you mentioned earlier that Star Trek thing, the Vulcans. You guys are too young to know about the Vulcans, but like, maybe not. But what's interesting about the Vulcans is that the Vulcans were humans who decided to adopt another story. They were people who were like emotional, murderous, combative, capitalism, blah, blah, blah. And they decided, because their planet was dying, to adopt another story of reason and none of that nonsense. And I really believe that it might be possible for one day us to adopt a story where this stuff isn't the way we work. Where we sound like something Jesus might have sung up instead of something like Satan rhymed up, Anyway, you've been very kind. Thank you so much. Yeah, okay. Huh. It's always good to see some folks. I'm wondering if there's any other people from my other beloved, identity locations, or any immigrants here. What's up? very silently. Where y'all from?
I'm Mexican.
Okay, where?
From Sinaloa.
Oh yeah, okay. Cool. I spent a year in El DF and never made it to Sinaloa. El DF is kind of like a labyrinth. I fell in love and didn't feel like leaving. Yeah, what about you?
Mexico, Chihuahua.
Oh, Chihuahua, okay. Again, all my friends are like from all these places and they're always like, come, and I just never left El DF. Every time I went to the periphery, it was like some strange vampire thing started happening. Like I couldn't move too far from my coffin, you know? Yeah, okay, cool. How about any Latinos here? Still very silent. Fucking Denver does it to you, huh, you guys? For real, I asked that question in Jersey and people are like, no, it's okay. We all have different relationships to public space.
We're the OGs of Latinos.
The OGs? Is that what it is?
That's right. We've been here a long time.
Yeah, my God, you guys have been here a hell of a long time. Okay, and finally, is there any Dominicans whatsoever? Wait, we have one?
Well, kind of close. My grandpa's Dominican, but I'm from Puerto Rico.
Shit, I'll take it. Come on, man. One must be generous with our visions of each other, you know? The nation is profoundly predicated on hybridity, not purity, so nice to hear it. Well, thank you guys all for being here. So look, here's what I'm thinking. We have an hour, yeah? And my nature is always to try to bring it in on time. And so I thought we would have a little talk, yeah? About what y'all want to talk about. I feel like that might be the best approach to these sort of things. I could give you some sort of prefatory comments, of course, which would be utterly useless, but you know, sometimes people require that. But I figured we could just talk. I mean, the thing is you must understand that I'm someone, like many of you, from what would be called a non-traditional artist background. Yeah, I did not come up either in a community or in a family or in a social milieu where pursuing the arts was even a remote possibility. And on top of that, I came up in a period in time when there were still a number of, you know, sort of intriguing youth movements that were still kind of pushing up against the world, yeah? The strange thing about growing up in the 80s, for those of us who came of age there, is that young people in the 80s really thought that the 90s was going to be a return to the 60s. Yeah. When you look at all the different movements and sort of all the kind of weird political organizations that were in circulation at the time, the imaginary was one that was actually supremely radicalized. And I kind of came up thinking that we were going to turn the corner and that all of these sort of utopian dreams of a lot of the folks that were ahead of me in college, that were ahead of me in organizations, that they were kind of bringing down into the neighborhoods, we really thought this was going to happen. And I think it's, I always say it's sort of nothing more emblematic about growing up in my generation than when you think about the two large musical streams that were most current in the geography that I grew up in. I always think that, like, listen, I grew up with like super crazy hip hop on one side and punk on the other, like literally parallel to each other. And that both of those spoke to a very different generational youth moment than I think we ended up sort of living in later. And as an artist, I also kind of was in this strange situation where I came up wanting to be an artist. For when I thought of it, when I narrativized it, it had a lot to do with growing up in a space both inside of my family and inside of the larger culture in which I was embedded, that we, folks like me, my family and my community, were almost entirely folk places. Writers would actually, the ones when I was coming up, they would write out a long 22-page paper and then present it. And again, I'm I don't know what it is. I've never really liked it at all. Maybe also as well, I sometimes think that part of this is probably just so much of what, why I'm interested in being an artist. Is like, there's something about the nature of that interaction, and to sit still while someone delivers 20-something pages, which can be incredibly useful. But for some reason, for me, I just don't seem to have the ability for it. So this is a long way of telling you, you ain't getting no fucking keynote whatsoever. Even though I told them, I warned them, they still put it up. I wonder if they think people are more likely to come if there's some sort of formalistic, programmatic rubric to it. I don't know. I can't imagine why anyone would extra excitedly come for a keynote versus an artist talk, but such is the way to all different folks. I guess I always begin by asking just some simple questions, and then I'll explain to you how I'm thinking about doing this. I'm always curious, is there anyone from New Jersey here, my beloved home state? Oh, where in New Jersey?
Scotch Plains.
Oh, I know Scotch Plains well. Okay. Is this another Jersey person?
Exit 13.
Oh, wow. I know 13 extra well. Yeah. Yeah, no. Yeah, we used to call growing up East Brick City. Yeah. Oh, man. I was exit 11. Thank you so much for coming out today. It's a beautiful day. You know, it's nice of you to make the sacrifice out here, yeah? Of course, I wanted to thank the festival for having me. I wanted to sort of, again, thank all the folks who made the event possible. You know the deal. Plenty of people work super hard to put these things together, and I really appreciate that work. Almost all of it invisible, yeah? Again, as always, it's always a great honor to be here to talk about art, you know, and what art provokes. Now, I always feel like there is some sort of false advertisement, right? I saw the schedule and they said a keynote presentation, which is a very funny thing. I don't know what it is. I think that we have patterns and it doesn't matter what people tell us. Do you know those like evidence resistance belief loops? Yeah. It doesn't matter, like anyone who's ever asked me to go anywhere, the first words out of my mouth is that I do not do keynotes at all. I don't like prepared comments. I'm an artist. I'm terrible at it. I also think I kind of, I sort of got allergic to it also, as well as any of us who grow up in the sort of Latin-American intellectual writer tradition. The appalling formality of that sort of vision of what an artist is always made me want to hang myself. Yeah, so, you know, in Santo Domingo and other